Heatwaves network brought together activists, business leaders, policy makers, and everyday citizens in its inaugural India Climate Summit to address the impact of climate change. These distinguished voices have championed the cause of climate action. They have been raising awareness and protecting the future of our planet. The summit brought forth its commitment to foster a sustainable nation, uniting stakeholders in a common agenda. Extreme heat is making working conditions unbearable across sectors. To dwell more on this and to understand how heat waves is endangering India's development, India Climate Summit brought together experts who are working across the country.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And of course, Sumaira ji, as I talked about heat wave, it's bad, ma'am. How do we understand when it comes to the situation that has been leading to such kind of changes, the climate change, it is a concern and we can see it.
I think that heat waves are part of a larger phenomenon. We called it global warming for a reason, and then changed it to climate change or made it climate change, because climate change encompasses the larger events which are happening as a result of rising temperatures. The heat wave is one manifestation across the world, as you said, even in London. But climate change includes the sudden kind of rain that we had, which was unseasonal, and all the other events which have been leading up to it. So heat waves are not something to be taken lightly. Everything that we do results in climate change. The trouble with climate change is that ordinary people believe that this is an issue for governments and that they are only the people who are suffering and kind of, in a way, the recipients of the problems, and they are helpless. The real fact is that every action that people take results in what they get, including government action, and it's up to us to make sure that we petition governments and make sure we get the kind of actions that we want. That includes air pollution, it includes noise pollution, it includes every other thing, destruction, landslides, floods, all those things which happen as a result of climate change, yes, but also as a result of local actions on the ground taken by both governments and people. And when we know that these things are happening, we have a disaster management plan in place, a national disaster management plan. Heat is included. Some of these other climate events are included. Cold is included. But the heat and the heat waves are not included in the action which is to be taken. It's only included in the list. So heat is also something which affects people disproportionately depending on their social and economic abilities and strata. And because of this, we need an action plan. We need advisories, health advisories to people, how to tackle increased air pollution, how to tackle heat waves, just as we have when we know there's going to be a flood or a cyclone. And these are actions which are very doable by the government. They should be implemented immediately so that people know at least what they have to do, and the divisions between people being able to access ways of protecting themselves from heat waves and other disasters are not restricted to those who can afford them.
And preemptive steps that you're saying are must and need to be taken.
Preemption and preventative action is the way to go. It's too late when these things are already upon us. We hear about how development is imperative for the people. It is imperative for the people that development takes place in such a way that their lives and health and work is protected too. Most of our country is in the informal sector. They work out in the heat, and they are the ones who are dying. We cannot have development for future generations which does not take into effect the action that we are imposing on them today.
Absolutely, because when it comes to development of a country, of a nation, simultaneously should go hand in hand, Dr. Kalpana, especially when it comes to climate change, because that's what I said, it's so visible that you can actually see. I mean, if you talk about our parents, they used to say, oh, it never used to rain at this point or in, this time of the month. How do you believe that when it comes to air pollution as well, has a direct impact on our human lifestyle?
Anything that, gets the population sensitized or the clinicians alerted, or for that matter, our entire, machinery to get into action is when we start seeing people dropping dead. And if heat waves and heat stroke deaths are a silent killer, you can imagine how underappreciated air pollution-related deaths are. Fortunately for us, we don't have episodes in which people are dropping dead that are visible, but yet a lot of people are dying, and dying slowly, and dying in large numbers. So heat and air pollution are really the two sides of the same coin as far as climate change is concerned. And one of the things that has to be sort of really appreciated this is air pollution is not just chronic respiratory disease, and heat waves is not heat stroke deaths. Both these risk factors impact every population subgroup across the lifespan, from in utero impacts to impacts in the neonatal period, to infant development, to adolescent health, to elderly health, including mental health, neurocognition. There is no boundaries as far as these two risk factors are concerned. And the other thing that is not very widely appreciated, I think, is that, why is this burden that, keeps coming out from the global models or even the national models so difficult to reconcile? You feel like we are not dropping dead every day or seeing people drop dead every day. Why is this number 7 million deaths attributable to air pollution, with 2 million just in India alone? Why is hundreds of thousands of deaths attributable, with 30% of those deaths attributable to heat waves in India alone? Where are these numbers coming from? Are these models, credible? Are these models, informed enough by India epidemiological investigations? Do we need to, reinvent the wheel and assess every single aspects of these health impacts in our population? It's really because these exposures, normally we think air pollution is an urban problem and a community health problem. And heat is really an occupational worker productivity problem. Nothing can be farther from the truth. It's really, heat is as much of a community problem. Air pollution is as much of a worker problem. And there are numbers to support that, wherein we are looking at 40% of the workforce being exposed to air pollution, and nearly 90% of our community populations in both rural and urban areas being exposed to unhealthy levels of air pollution.
Right, but ma'am, you just piqued my interest when you mentioned about urban and rural. How do we actually signify that? Because this time around, whenever there is air pollution and Delhi being at the center of this, in a few months from now, unfortunately, annually, this is something that we have been witnessing. Indeed. There is obvious blame game that has been happening, but how do you actually define or differentiate between rural and urban areas? It's the same air that everyone is breathing.
Exactly. There is no difference, but yet much of the attention to air quality actions has been devoted to attainment in the largest of metropolitan cities. Whereas air is unhealthy for all populations in rural and urban areas. And therefore, there is an opportunity now for us to recognize that the big numbers, the health burden is really coming from air being unhealthy and heat being unbearable throughout the country. And rural areas, one of the most under-recognized factor is the emissions from the continued use of solid fuels for cooking. We talked about not cutting trees for some, sporadic purposes like, perhaps, having electronic voting machines. But you really look at how many trees are we cutting every day for supplying everyday cooking needs for rural populations. So these are really low-hanging fruits, and fortunately, our National Clean Air Program takes very much cognizance of this very important source of ambient air pollution, not just household air pollution. So every woman who cooks with biomass is not only getting exposed herself, is exposing her family members, but these emissions are going outdoors. And half of Delhi's problems, or probably a third of Delhi's problems, is because of quite a bit of the neighboring states' rural populations having to rely on this traditional source of energy and resulting in bad air quality. So you cannot get Delhi's air right without getting the entire air sheds.
So there are several factors that we need to
Several
take
factors.
into account. But Mr. Alam, as far as the solution is concerned, because now we all have to come across to you and understand, we know the problems, how do we solve them?
Before I talk about the solutions, let me just add maybe 2 more points as a part of the problem. We talked about the climate change and increasing the temperature. But one thing that we also need to basically keep in the equation is shifting the monsoon and shifting the summer. It is not only that the temperature is increasing, but also season is also changing. And if we look into this, the changes of the temperature with the changes of the summer, that increases the demand of the electricity or the other power. If we look into this, the heat wave is basically increasing the demand for cooling. And if we look into the increase of the demand for cooling, in the last 4 or 5 years, the increase for the electricity for the cooling demand has increases. And it is around the 4% if we look into the peak load. If we look into the peak load in that context, is the 4% has increased. If we look into the consumption point of view, it is about 21% has increased in terms of the electricity consumption. So we need to look into not only the problem, where the demand also coming, and we talked about the clean, the sources of the electricity. We have heard about the renewable. So we need to look into the solution in a holistic manner. And then what I'd like to mention when we're talking about the solution is the solution, obviously, usually we go for the active cooling. We put the air con when we have the affordability to purchase the devices. But if we look into the other options available in terms of the passive cooling that we call, and the passive cooling is nothing new. If we look into the different types of the building design, the shade for the cooling, as well as the insulation. So it is nothing new that we are talking about in terms of the passive cooling. But what is important is we used to do it as a part of the voluntary in nature. But I think this is the right time to make it as a part of the building design and the code. It is a part of the city planning and the land use planning, so that we have the adequate space outside the building so that we have the ventilation. And if we look into the spaces reducing in the cities and urban area, it is reducing a lot, meaning that the space for the passive cooling is also reducing. If we look into the space for the trees, the space for the water bodies, all are shrinking because of the urban growth. So I think this is the right time for us collectively go for the design part of the passive cooling aspect, as well as the creating the space for that we have the higher ventilation and the open space which will provide the passive cooling.